They chose a room without windows. Margaret noticed that immediately. Rooms without windows were designed to make people lose their sense of time, to make conversations feel heavier, more final. She had sat in rooms like this before, decades earlier, when she and her husband negotiated contracts that involved numbers large enough to scare people into silence. Back then, no one had underestimated her. Now, at 72, everything about her presence invited exactly that. The table was long, polished, cold to the touch. The chairs on one side were already occupied. The chair on the other side, hers, stood slightly apart, as if accidentally placed there at the last moment. Margaret took her seat without comment. Across from her sat her late husband's brother, his wife, and two younger men she recognized as distant relatives who had never shown interest in the family business until Thomas was no longer alive to stop them. A lawyer sat at the far end of the table, his briefcase unopened, his posture neutral. He hadn't spoken yet. He didn't need to. The meeting had already been decided before she walked in. "We'll take care of everything," her brother-in-law said gently, folding his hands as if in prayer. "You don't need to worry anymore." Margaret tilted her head slightly, studying him. Worry. It was always framed as concern, never control, never removal. "Everything?" she asked. "Yes," his wife added quickly. "The estate, the accounts, the properties. You've been through enough. This will make things easier." Easier for whom was a question Margaret didn't bother to ask. She already knew the answer. A folder slid across the table toward her, thick, official, covered in tabs and highlighted sections, as if to guide her hand where they wanted it to go. Margaret didn't touch it. She looked instead at the faces around the table, the polite impatience, the restrained confidence, the assumption that she would comply because compliance was expected of someone her age, someone alone, someone grieving. They believed grief had softened her. They were wrong. "I'd like to read it," she said. There was a pause, just a fraction of a second too long. "Of course," one of the younger men said, forcing a smile. "Take your time." But his fingers tapped the table, once, twice. Margaret opened the folder. The language was dense by design. Legal phrases layered like fog, each sentence carefully shaped to appear protective while quietly transferring authority. Power shifted hands without ever using the word power. She read every page. Her silence unsettled them. They expected questions, confusion, maybe a laugh, an admission that this was all too much. Instead, Margaret turned page after page with the patience of someone who understood exactly what was being attempted. When she reached the final document, she closed the folder. "Where does my signature authorize this?" she asked calmly. Her brother-in-law leaned forward. "Here and here. It's standard procedure." "Standard for whom?" "For families in situations like this," his wife said. "Widows shouldn't have to manage these burdens alone." Widow. The word landed heavily, like a label they hoped would define the limits of her authority. Margaret nodded slowly, as if accepting the logic. She reached into her handbag. The room subtly relaxed. They thought this was the moment she would pull out a pen. Instead, she removed a thin, worn folder. The edges were soft from years of handling. No highlights, no tabs, just paper. She placed it on the table. "This was prepared 5 years ago," Margaret said. "My husband asked me to keep it separate." The lawyer looked up for the first time. "May I?" he asked. Margaret slid the folder toward him. As he opened it, the room's energy shifted. The polite confidence drained, replaced by curiosity, then unease. The lawyer read silently at first. Then he adjusted his glasses. Then he leaned closer. "What is that?" one of the men asked sharply. The lawyer didn't answer. He turned a page, then another. "This document," he said slowly, "is an amendment." "That's impossible," her brother-in-law snapped. "The will was finalized years ago." "Yes," the lawyer replied, "and then amended. Properly filed, properly executed." The room erupted. "That can't be right." "We would have known." "This is a mistake." Margaret said nothing. Thomas had trusted process more than people. He believed paper endured when intentions changed. He had prepared for moments like this, not because he doubted Margaret, but because he understood how quickly others would. The lawyer raised his hand. These amendments specify that any attempt to consolidate authority without full transparency triggers a reversal of control. Reversal to whom? The wife demanded. The lawyer met her eyes. To Mrs. Hale. Silence crashed into the room. Margaret felt it settle, heavy and absolute. That's not all, the lawyer continued, pulling out additional pages. There are records attached, communications, financial movements, timelines. The younger men exchanged glances, their confidence fractured. These documents indicate that certain decisions were made prematurely, the lawyer said, under the assumption that Mrs. Hale would not challenge them. Margaret folded her hands in her lap. That assumption had been their first mistake. The lawyer closed the folder. This meeting is concluded, he said. Any further actions based on the proposed documents would constitute legal overreach. Margaret stood. No one stopped her. As she reached the door, she paused, not to gloat, not to threaten. You thought you were helping, she said softly. But help doesn't begin by erasing someone. She left the room without looking back. Outside, the hallway felt brighter, wider. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. The fight wasn't over, but the balance had shifted, and they knew it. Margaret didn't go home after leaving the building. That surprised even her. For years, home had been her refuge, the one place where the silence felt earned rather than imposed. But today, silence carried too many echoes, too many unfinished sentences. She walked instead. The city had changed since Thomas passed, or maybe she had. Buildings looked taller, sharper, less forgiving. People moved faster, eyes fixed forward, unaware that power shifts didn't always happen loudly. Sometimes they happened behind closed doors, over polished tables, with carefully chosen words. She stopped at a small cafe she and Thomas used to visit when negotiations ran long. Back then, they would sit side by side, not speaking much, letting the tension dissolve before going home. Margaret ordered tea and took a seat near the window. Her phone vibrated. She didn't need to look to know who it was. They always reached out too soon. You didn't have to leave like that, her brother-in-law said when she answered. His voice was softer now, cautious. We were just trying to help. Margaret stirred her tea slowly. You were trying to decide for me, she replied. That's not fair. No, she said. It's accurate. A pause. We can still talk this through. She smiled faintly. You already did. She ended the call. Across the street, reflected in the glass, she caught her own image. Smaller than she once was, perhaps, but steadier, clearer. They had underestimated her endurance. They thought survival meant passivity. They were wrong again. The next call came an hour later, from the lawyer. I thought you should know, he said. They've requested another meeting. Margaret laughed softly. Already? They believe there may have been a misunderstanding. Margaret knew better. They believed pressure could still work if applied differently. Tell them I'll attend, she said. But not today. She needed time, not to plan revenge, but to confirm truth. The strongest reversals were never emotional. They were precise. That evening, Margaret unlocked the study Thomas had kept meticulously organized, shelves lined with binders, each labeled in his careful handwriting. This room had been their shared language, their unspoken agreement that clarity was protection. She opened a drawer she hadn't touched in years. Inside were duplicates, every amendment, every contingency, every just in case. Thomas hadn't prepared because he expected betrayal. He prepared because he understood human behavior when power appeared unclaimed. Margaret sat at his desk and read until midnight. By morning, she knew exactly how far this went, and how much they had already exposed themselves. The second meeting was held 2 days later, this time in a larger conference room. More people present, more formality, a deliberate attempt to regain narrative control. Margaret arrived early. She always did. She chose her seat carefully, not opposite them, but at the head of the table. It was a small detail. It mattered. They entered together, rehearsed unity written across their faces. Her brother-in-law avoided her eyes this time. His wife did not. The lawyer took his place, calm, observant. Mrs. Hale, one of the younger men began. We want to clear the air. Margaret nodded. Please. They spoke at length, about family, about legacy, about honoring Thomas's wishes. Words floated easily when accountability was still abstract. Then Margaret reached into her bag. She placed 3 folders on the table. These, she said, are bank statements. The lawyer leaned forward. They show asset movement, Margaret continued, beginning 6 weeks before my husband passed. The room stilled. That's impossible, her brother-in-law said quickly. No authority existed at that time. Correct, Margaret replied, which makes the transfers interesting. The lawyer opened the first folder. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. These accounts, he said, were not dormant. Margaret watched the realization ripple outward. They had acted early, quietly, confidently, too confidently. There's more, Margaret said. She slid forward a second folder. Emails, she explained. Drafted plans, discussions, assuming incapacity. The wife stood abruptly. This is an ambush. No, Margaret said evenly. It's documentation. The lawyer raised his hand again. These communications suggest intent, he said, and coordination. Silence stretched thin. You thought I wouldn't look, Margaret said, her voice steady. You thought grief would make me careless. Her brother-in-law swallowed hard. We were protecting the estate. No, she replied. You were protecting yourselves. The lawyer closed the folder. At this point, he said, there is sufficient cause to initiate a formal inquiry. The room fractured. Anger, panic, calculation. Margaret felt none of it, only clarity. This doesn't have to escalate, the wife said sharply. Families solve things privately. Margaret met her gaze. Families don't strip each other quietly. The meeting ended without agreement. That was the moment they realized control was gone. Within days, letters arrived. Official, unavoidable. The inquiry expanded. Audits were ordered, oversight imposed. Margaret received calls from people she hadn't heard from in years. Bank managers, advisors, former partners. All suddenly attentive, all suddenly respectful. The narrative had flipped. She was no longer the widow to be managed. She was the authority to be answered to. And still, she said little. Power, she had learned, didn't need volume. The final hearing was scheduled quickly, faster than expected. Evidence has a way of accelerating truth. Margaret entered the courtroom alone. They entered together, eyes downcast now, their earlier confidence replaced by something closer to disbelief. The judge reviewed the files silently, then spoke. The court recognizes Mrs. Hale as the sole executor, with full authority, he said, effective immediately. Margaret felt the weight lift, not relief but confirmation. The judge continued. Further actions taken prior to this designation will be examined under misconduct provisions. The gavel struck. It was over. Outside, cameras waited. Questions hung in the air. Margaret declined them all. 6 months later, the estate was stable, transparent, precisely as Thomas had intended. Some relationships did not recover. That was acceptable. Margaret returned to the cafe one quiet afternoon, ordering tea, choosing the same seat. This time, the silence felt earned again. She had not raised her voice. She had not fought back loudly. She had simply refused to disappear. And in doing so, she had ended everything they tried to quietly take from her.